Good to see you again, Christian.
Good to see you.
Slightly different format we've got here, but we'll see how it goes. And welcome to the first show of the Cost Cafe.
Oh, thank you.
So the whole point of this of the Cost Cafe is not we're not sort of a webinar or anything like that. It is let's discuss the goings on in estimating. We'll discuss sort of key things that are interesting to you, that are annoying you maybe about what consistent mistakes that people make and everything. And then we're also going to drop in a shout out for your book, and the viewers are going to have a chance to uh, get a copy of your book for free, all about risk management, which again, I think for the viewers, I'll just quickly show it here. So that's solving for project risk management, understanding the critical role of uncertainty in project management. That's a huge topic, and very much a needed topic. So, in your opinion, I think I'm going to drop the first thing in there, which is do do practitioners apply risk management principles in the right way?
Generally, no. Unfortunately, no. There's a variety of issues, and we'll talk about some of them. One is there's a prevalent use of risk matrices, which is really a qualitative technique, but sometimes they use it to um, do a quantitative assessment. And what happens is they leave out a lot of risks when you do that, so you underestimate the true risk ranges. And then even when people do a true quantitative risk analysis, there's a systematic tendency to underestimate the true risk ranges. I learned this lesson working on a project years ago and looking back at the history of the project and how it evolved over time. And we updated the risk analysis on a annual or semi-annual basis. And I saw that every time we did an update, the risk ranges would grow wider and then they would shift to the right. So we were somewhat independent in that we were not working directly for the contractors that were building the project, but we were influenced by the project management itself, which is optimistic. There's a innate tendency that's been noted by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky called the planning fallacy, that you tend to plan for the best case. And I saw this happen there. So you tend to underestimate risk. As a whole, we don't really go back and look at our analyses to see how closely they came to the mark. So that it's hard to improve on your performance unless you actually look and see how you've done in the past. So we need to do more of that. In the book, I talk about, give some examples of how bad that track record is, and we don't tend to look at it, but when you do look at it, it looks pretty bad. So the few cases you can find is pretty bad. So we need to do better in that regard. One way, short-term, somewhat fix, is to do some benchmarking or calibration of your risk analysis to historical costs, growth, and historical schedule delays. And there are ways to do that. I talk about that in the book. Um, there are some other issues as well. When you look at risk analysis and you do risk analysis, you tend to produce a percentile of a probability distribution that's known as an S curve, the cumulative probability distribution. So you say, okay, we're going to fund to the 70th percentile, which means there's only a 30% chance that this project will
But
overrun.
with that, how many people do you find actually understand what an S curve is?
The S curves are actually pretty easy to explain to management. That's why they're commonly used. Even you kind of joke that when you go to management, you need to draw things out with crayon sometimes because you have to keep things very simple. But and
Yeah,
that's not taking away that it's not saying that these folks are not intelligent. I've worked for some very intelligent management. One of my bosses was the was an engineer by profession, and he was actually the a three-star general. He was the highest ranked engineer in the Department of Defense. So, but they don't tend to can't keep things simple for them because they are trying to absorb a lot of information. But they do tend to understand the idea of S curve. So you say, okay, we're going to fund this project to the point where there is a 70% chance we'll meet our budget. When you only look at that as your only risk measure, which is where a lot of people stop, you're ignoring a lot of the extreme risks that are out in the right tail in cost and then the schedule. So you're ignoring those extreme risks. That's where what I call the dragons of risk lurk. Old maps tended to have monsters and sea serpents and dragons in areas that were uncharted, and so there's a lot of those dragons that are lurking out there in the tails. And there are
yeah,
risk
I think
measures that will
that's
take
really
that into
cool.
account.
They be dragons.
Here be dragons. Yeah,
Yeah, there be
there,
dragons is quite a cool.
that was the original title of my book, but it kept getting getting poo-pooed upon when I was marketing my book because they said it was too obscure.
Yeah, maybe two Lord of the Rings or
Maybe,
yeah.
or Game of Thrones, or yeah, something. Yeah, yeah,
Or Game of Thrones, yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. No, that's quite cool. Yeah, so I guess the biggest thing going on right now, which is COVID, is that an
Yes,
example of an extreme risk?
it's an extreme risk, high consequence. In terms of pandemics, pandemics are a type of phenomenon that have extremely fat right tails in terms of the number of deaths. Um, People debate whether or not is COVID a black swan. But it really wasn't surprising in the sense that we know pandemic risk is out there, and experts have been saying for some time that something like this has been coming because you look at the number of epidemics in which at least 1,000 people have died. We're getting about one of those events a year, and we used to get one of those events a decade. And part of that is the increase in global travel,
Hmm.
as incomes rise, people tend to travel more. It's a huge burgeoning middle class in China. It's probably the same case in India and other countries like that. Pakistan has a large population. So as these populations become more wealthy, they're
Hmm.
they're traveling more. So there's an increase in global travel. We know that because the wet markets in China, that a lot, other coronaviruses have emerged from that area, and we think that's where maybe COVID came from. So that is a vector to spread diseases. So these are things that are becoming more likely. But yes, it's extreme risk. In the history of pandemics, so far, partly because of lockdown measures, and also now we have a vaccine. The impact has been muted a little bit. So there's some risk management that's been somewhat applied, if not always applied early enough or well. But there is some mismanagement. But in terms of the overall history of pandemics, if you adjust for population, COVID is probably more than higher than the median, but less than the 70th percentile.
How do you see then? So I'm just trying to relate it back to what we do day to day in terms of cost risk management and um, sort of how would how would you apply? So how would you apply something like an extreme right tail risk, such as
So
COVID,
the
if you're a
yeah,
cost engineer?
so the way to look at extreme risk, and what you're looking at is so this is a little bit outside of what you typically look at as a cost engineer. You're many cases when you're looking as a cost engineer, you're looking at what is my most likely outcome, what is my expected outcome, and then you put some variation around it. But you are concerned largely about is what do we think it most likely will cost. But with extreme events like COVID, you're concerned about how bad can it be. You're looking at the maximum. So instead of looking at averages, now you're looking at extremes. And there is a pretty well developed statistical theory called extreme value theory that looks at that. Basically, these kinds of things follow a power law. So as you look at the probability that deaths exceed a certain amount, and you look at that probability, it declines, but it declines very slowly. And you put it on a log graph, and you basically get a straight line. And risks like COVID, the kind of the risks that are relatively mild, if you're modeling something with a normal or log normal distribution, you have a finite mean, a finite variance. But then we start getting extreme risk, and COVID is one of those where neither of the first two moments is finite. They're called infinite moments. Even though we do have a finite population, there is no. What it means is that there is no really representative member of the population. You can't take a sample mean and expect to get what I expect the average outcome to be. But by looking at extreme value theory and looking at the tail, you can sort of plan for what you think are 1 in 100 year events or 1 in 1,000 year events, things like that. That's what the Netherlands does. The Netherlands is a country that is largely under sea level, and they've had an elaborate system of dikes for several centuries to prevent flooding. They don't build their dikes for the average flood. They build them for a 1 in 1,000 year flood, and they use extreme value theory. So they build their dikes in preparation for a 1 in 1,000 year flood, and that way they're able to keep a lot of their land and live on their land. Whereas if they plan for average dikes, most of the country would be underwater. So it's the same sort of planning should
Yeah,
be done for
yeah.
COVID. It's the same sort of planning should be done for COVID. So if you
Mm.
should plan for our pandemic policy should be geared towards um, COVID type of risk, or maybe even worse. If something could be even worse. I mean, if we had um, Ebola, for example, is seems to be deadlier than COVID, but so far they've been able to,
Mm.
anytime there's outbreaks, they've been able to tamp it down through acting very fast. So we need policies in place. We need people need to be responsible. We also probably need some central policies in place for to shut things down very quickly and to test, trace, isolate. We need some plans in place to prepare for it. We can't really predict when we're not even done with COVID yet, but hopefully with the vaccines and things will slow down. We'll get back to normal, but we can't really plan for when the next COVID will strike. But we can be prepared for it.
But then the other side of it is, do you think that there's a tendency in human nature as well? So we say that when we plan projects, and there's a, Kahneman, Tversky, in their studies, they found that people tend to be optimistic in their predictions and their assumptions. Do you think that post COVID, in a post COVID world, at least for a little while, things are going to be down the other side of the spectrum? So it'll be everyone's overly pessimistic, and actually, there's an expectation that something's likely to go wrong.
There may be a little bit, people may be a little bit more cautious. You do see when extreme events occur, you do see a little more respect paid to risk. People um, and business got a lot more interested in risk after the financial crisis of 2007, which affected a lot of industries around the world. And so you saw the emergence of enterprise risk management became very popular for a while. But now it's kind of and then kind of sort of died away again. Now you have a different type of risk with COVID, which also has had a significant economic impact. So people will likely pay a little more attention to risk for a little while, but then they may wind up becoming complacent again. That's the problem with extreme risk, is they don't occur often enough for people to really stay vigilant.
If we look at the other side, after COVID, we've normalized from COVID, people are getting back to their normal lives. A lot of companies potentially will have gone out of business. People will be downsizing. People will be, cutting certain overhead costs just to kind of rebuild, essentially build up again. Um, there's always a risk of, when you're in an engineering firm, that if you're not the engineer, or the person with the ideas, you might be considered as redundant, pretty much, as you're an excess,
Hmm.
and that's always could be the perception of
Right.
someone like a cost engineer. So, from your perspective, how would a cost engineer go about, you know, proving that they are worth their weight in, or worth their wages, essentially, in this post COVID world?
Right. That's a good question. So, I do find though that in my experience that and things will be tight for a while. Some budgets will be declining, and that is when cost estimators are most valued. Is when times are tight, and they really want to figure out what they can afford. So that's when, when budgets are rising and companies are making a lot of profit, and then they're not so concerned about costs, but they will be concerned about costs when times are tight because they will need to figure out what they can afford. So I think the role of cost estimating will only be considered more important, at least for a while, because of this. A key thing, though, you are right, though. If you Cost estimating is basically an overhead function to some extent. We are not building something. We're not contributing directly to the bottom line. So if a company is trying to find places to cut, that is, they do try to cut overhead. So we have to be careful about that. But a large part of that is, being engaged with engineers, communicating with engineers, and then showing how you can provide value by providing good estimates and updating your estimates in a timely fashion, and reaching out to the engineers and staying engaged with the project office and the project manager. And so the organizations I've seen where the cost engineers are heavily engaged with management and engineers, the cost estimators are heavily involved. Uh, they are more valued, and they see the value, and they're given more work, and then the work expands. Communication and the softer skills are at least half the job of a cost estimator, in my experience. Um, you know, I think as a cost engineer, working on that, doing some self-education, maybe taking a class, um, reaching out, trying to work on your presentation skills, all those kinds of things will help you. Um, I was interested in um, the personality of my cost group when I was at Missile Defense Agency, and this is actually the 10th anniversary of when I was promoted to the cost director for the Missile Defense Agency, by the way, March 15th, 2011. Um, and one of the things I did was I was curious about what the personality types of my organization was. And so it's just on a volunteer basis. I could not require anyone to do this, but I just asked people to figure out, go online, take a Myers-Briggs, and there's lots of different Myers-Briggs, exams out there, and they classify people as either intuitive, introverted, extroverted, intuitive, let's say intuitive thinking, or intuitive sensing, thinking, feeling, and perceptive and judgmental. And the first one is a very big one for us, because one of the things I found was that most of the group were introverted. And it's not too big a stretch to imagine that. You probably could have figured that out, just because we are analytical, so more analytical people are introverted. So that may be a little bit of a challenge, is that uh, most of the cost estimators were introverted, and then it came to they were either sensing or intuitive. I think they were sensing, they were thinking rather than feeling, and then they were judgmental rather than perceptive. So they were, I think most of them were ISTJs. And so, but the introvert is a big important one. So you may have to you may have to work a little bit to be more communicative if you're an introvert by nature. One of the things I found was that working directly and being embedded directly in a project office, that cost estimators did a lot better than the day-to-day interactions. Um, Introverts communicate a lot better when they're close, physically close to someone. And the project managers also find them more useful when they can reach out and talk to them right at that time. So, um, the more closely you can be located to the project office, the better.
The numbers can't talk for themselves as much as people think they do. When people see a number, they can't just make an assumption on what it means. You need to
Right.
tell that story. So yeah, speaking of telling stories, we've got obviously you've authored a book which came out last October, I believe. So
Yes.
what's it all about? So you'll see my bookmark. I have gotten most of the way through it. It's reading it is it's quite fascinating because um, it's sort of one of my favorite pages is that picture that you've got with the map and with the dragons out there. Um, and I think it's a very unique way of looking at what risk is, um, and people's perceptions of the unknown, especially. How would you summarize what the main takeaways are from the book, and why someone should read the book?
Sure. So risk is important, regardless of whether you do not you acknowledge it. It's out there, and it affects all projects. It affects everything that we do in life. All our decisions are decisions made under uncertainty. It's especially important for cost estimating and schedule estimating, because there's a tendency to uh, want to underfund and try to do things more quickly than should be done. And as a cost estimator, you need to be armed with the knowledge and capabilities to rebut those arguments from management. So, it's very important. It needs to be done quantitatively. I give lots of reasons in the book why it should be quantitative in nature. Risk analysis needs to be quantitative, but even when it's done, there's still some obstacles to doing it well. And I talk about these in the book. We talked about one, underestimating risk ranges. The fact that when you look at projects, they're typically not conducted in isolation, but rather as part of a portfolio. So you need to do portfolio analysis as well, and that's something that's often neglected. There's some sort of hope that risk at the overall program level will be less just because of diversification, but the the risk reduction due to diversification depends upon the risk and reward, and also the manner in which you analyze risk and where you set your budget. So um, you know, spoiler alert, don't fund to the 50th percentile, because you're going to underestimate risk at the project level. And then also that's going to make the risk actually worse at the portfolio level. Perversely enough, it's called a negative portfolio effect. Talk about that in the book. So there's lots of issues with performing risk analysis and doing it right. And I talk about those in the book. I think if you're a net cost estimator and you're not doing risk analysis, this should we kind of wake up and smell the coffee kind of moment, and you should start doing it. If you are doing risk analysis, this will give you tips on how to do it better.
It's not a technical book. There's it's very accessible. You obviously need to understand these applications in some sense, but what I would say is it's applicable across different project types and different industries. And also,
Yes.
what I've tended to find is if I go and try and research risk, finding the areas that apply around estimating is a challenge sometimes, because you look at risk applied to loads of different scenarios and different applications, from engineering applications to nuclear physics to to all kinds of different risk applications. And what you've got here is a book which contains, here are different applications to areas in projects. And that's what makes it unique for me, is that uh, it's not even just a starter for 10. It is, if you want to go somewhere to understand risk in projects, this is a place to go. And you will understand concepts, and you will start to understand how you can apply them. And then from there, it's almost like you're basing your foundation, and you can go from there. So I think I find that really, really helpful, especially if you are someone who hasn't necessarily applied risk in a quantitative way before. It makes it very applicable, very, very accessible. So highly recommended. And like we say, the links will be in the description. Christian, I think we're going to be doing a bit of a giveaway as well. So I think we're looking at two lucky viewers will and listeners will have a chance to win a couple of copies that will be sent free of charge. All you need to do is subscribe first on the YouTube channel that you're watching this on. Then you need to go to the Society of Cost Engineers website, which again, link below. Apply for a free membership. Once you've done those two things, you'll be sent a free copy. Like I said, really appreciate you coming on the show today, coming on to the Cost Cafe, first episode.
Oh, thank you, Amrit. It's good talking to you.